The construction crew thought they'd hit an old pet cemetery when the bones started showing up under the Miller Creek Bridge in Riverside, Ohio. It was supposed to be a routine renovation project. Tear down the old concrete bridge that had been crumbling since the 1960s and put up something modern that could handle today's traffic. Nobody expected to find human remains buried 6 feet under what should have been solid ground. But here's what made everyone's blood run cold. Those bones belonged to Lisa Marie Walsh, a 19-year-old college student who vanished on a snowy February night in 19. For 52 years, her family was told she'd run away to California with some hippie boyfriend. The police files were marked voluntary missing person, and the case was essentially closed before it began. Except Lisa never made it past the city limits. She never made it past Miller Creek Bridge. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about small-town America and the people we trust to keep us safe. Because the person responsible for Lisa's death wasn't some drifter passing through town. It wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadow. It was someone the entire community respected. Someone who helped search for Lisa. Someone who comforted her grieving parents while knowing exactly where she was buried. And before this story ends, you'll discover that Lisa wasn't his only victim, not even close. February 18, 1971 started like any other Thursday for Lisa Marie Walsh. The mercury had been dropping all week in Riverside, Ohio, a farming community of about 3,200 people nestled in the rolling hills of Hamilton County, about 40 miles northeast of Cincinnati. Lisa was a sophomore at Riverside Community College, studying to become an elementary school teacher with dreams of working with kindergartners who still believed in magic and possibility. Lisa lived in a small second-floor apartment above Murphy's hardware store on Main Street, just 3 blocks from the campus that had been built in the late 1950s to serve the rural communities scattered throughout Hamilton County. Her apartment was tiny but cozy, a single bedroom, a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove, and a living room barely large enough for a couch and coffee table. The windows faced east, catching the morning sun that Lisa loved to wake up to, and from her kitchen window, she could see all the way to Miller Creek Bridge, the aging concrete span that connected downtown Riverside to the newer residential area where most of the college students lived. Her parents, Robert and Margaret Walsh, owned Walsh's Diner on the edge of town, the kind of place that had been the heart of small-town America for generations. The diner sat on Route 22, the main highway that brought truckers through Riverside on their way between Cincinnati and Columbus. It was open from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day except Christmas, serving up coffee that was always fresh, pie that was made from scratch every morning, and the kind of hearty meals that satisfied men who worked with their hands and women who were raising families on tight budgets. The Walsh family had run the diner since 1954, when Robert returned from the Korean War and used his GI Bill benefits to purchase the failing restaurant from its previous owner. Margaret had been his high school sweetheart, and they'd married in 1952 when he was home on leave. Together they'd built Walsh's Diner into more than just a restaurant. It was a community gathering place, an unofficial town hall where local politics were debated over morning coffee, where high school couples went for milkshakes after football games, and where traveling salesmen could count on a friendly face and a good meal. Lisa had been born in 1951, 2 years after her parents opened the diner. She'd grown up in the restaurant, doing her homework at corner booth number 6, helping her mother serve pie to customers who'd watched her grow from a pigtailed little girl into a poised young woman. She was pretty in the wholesome all-American way that small towns treasured. Shoulder-length blonde hair that she wore in a flip, blue eyes that sparkled when she laughed, and a smile that could light up the diner's sometimes gloomy interior. By 1971, Lisa had worked at the diner part-time for 6 years, ever since she'd turned 13 and her parents had decided she was old enough to help out during busy periods. She knew every regular customer by name, remembered how they liked their coffee, and could make small talk with truckers passing through, who were lonely for conversation with a pretty girl who didn't judge them for the lives they'd chosen. That Thursday, February 18th, had been busier than usual at Walsh's Diner. A late winter storm was moving across Ohio, and truckers were trying to make good time before the roads became impassable. The lunch rush had stretched until almost 3 p.m., and the dinner crowd had started early, with local families coming in for pot roast and meatloaf before the weather got worse. Lisa had been scheduled to work the evening shift, 4 p.m. to close, helping her mother serve customers and clean up while her father handled the grill and the cash register. She'd arrived at the diner straight from her afternoon classes at the college, still carrying her textbooks and wearing the navy blue wool coat that her grandmother had given her for Christmas. The evening had passed normally at first. The usual cast of characters filtered in and out, farmers grabbing quick dinners before heading home to tend to their livestock, truck drivers warming up with coffee and pie before continuing their runs, Young couples on dates looking for somewhere inexpensive but nice to spend time together. Lisa moved between tables with practiced efficiency, chatting with customers she'd known her whole life, and making newcomers feel welcome with her genuine smile and easy conversation. Around 7 p.m., the snow had started falling in earnest. Fat flakes that stuck to the diner's windows and began accumulating on the cars parked outside. By 8 p.m. the storm had intensified enough that some customers were deciding to head home rather than risk driving in worsening conditions. By 9 p.m., the diner was nearly empty except for one table of truck drivers who were debating whether to push on to Columbus or find a motel room for the night. Margaret Walsh had started the closing routine early, wiping down tables and chairs, refilling salt and pepper shakers, and counting the money in the register while Robert cleaned the grill and put away the food that would keep until tomorrow. Lisa helped with the usual tasks, sweeping the dining area, washing the last load of dishes, and making sure the coffee pots were cleaned and ready for the morning shift. The truck drivers had left around 9:20 p.m., declaring that they'd rather risk the drive than pay for a motel room. Margaret had locked the front door behind them and turned the sign from open to closed, then returned to the kitchen to help finish up the evening's work. Around 9:30 p.m., with everything cleaned and organized for the next day, Lisa had grabbed her purse and her heavy winter coat from the hook beside the back door. The snow was still falling steadily, and the wind had picked up, creating small drifts against the diner's windows and making the neon sign creak and sway on its metal brackets. "Drive careful, honey," Margaret had called out as Lisa headed for the door. "The roads are getting slick, and you know how that old bridge gets when it's icy." "I'll be fine, Mom. It's only a 5-minute drive, and I've got good tires." Lisa had waved goodbye and stepped into the swirling snow, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air as she hurried toward her bright yellow Volkswagen Beetle parked behind the diner. The drive from Walsh's diner to Lisa's apartment above Murphy's hardware store was indeed only about 5 minutes under normal conditions. The route took her north on Route 22 for about 2 miles, then left onto County Road 15, which wound through a residential area of small houses and tree-lined streets, before crossing Miller Creek Bridge and continuing into the downtown area where Main Street intersected with College Avenue. Miller Creek Bridge was the only way to get from the southern part of Riverside, where the diner was located, to the northern part, where the college and most of the student housing were situated. The bridge had been built in 1936 as part of a Works Progress Administration project, a concrete span about 200 feet long and 24 feet wide that carried 2 lanes of traffic over Miller Creek, a small waterway that meandered through Hamilton County before eventually joining the Little Miami River. By 1971, the bridge was showing its age. The concrete deck was cracked in several places, the railings were chipped and stained, and the expansion joints had gaps wide enough that you could see the creek water flowing beneath. The county highway department inspected it annually, and always declared it safe, but local residents had been talking for years about the need for a replacement. The problem was money. Hamilton County was primarily agricultural, with a small tax base that couldn't easily support major infrastructure projects. Lisa never made it home that night. When she didn't show up for her 8 a.m. Western Civilization class on Friday morning, her roommate Jenny Patterson wasn't immediately concerned. Lisa was one of the most reliable people Jenny had ever known, but college students sometimes overslept, especially after working late shifts at part-time jobs. When Lisa missed her 10 a.m. education methods class, Jenny started to worry. When she wasn't home by noon, Jenny called Walsh's diner. Margaret Walsh felt that familiar knot of maternal worry tighten in her starting, as she listened to Jenny explain that Lisa hadn't come home Thursday night. Lisa had never, not once in her 19 years, stayed out all night without calling home. She didn't drink much, rarely dated, and had never been the type of girl to make impulsive decisions that might worry her parents. By 1 p.m., Margaret had closed the diner and driven to Lisa's apartment with Robert. Jenny let them in with her spare key, and together they searched the small space for any clues about where Lisa might have gone. Her bed hadn't been slept in. Her textbooks were scattered on her desk exactly as she'd left them Thursday afternoon. Her nightgown was still laid out on her pillow, where she placed it every morning. There were no signs of packing, no indication that she'd planned to go anywhere except home from work. Robert Walsh called the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department at 2. The desk sergeant who took his call was experienced enough to know that a 19-year-old college student missing for less than 24 hours wasn't usually cause for immediate alarm. But something in Robert's voice, the quiet desperation of a father who knew his daughter better than anyone, convinced him to dispatch a deputy right away. Deputy Tom Bradley arrived at the Walsh home around. Bradley was 35 years old, a 12-year veteran of the sheriff's department, who'd worked everything from domestic disputes to cattle rustling in his time with Hamilton County. He was methodical by nature and experienced enough to know that most missing person cases resolved themselves within 48 hours, usually with sheepish phone calls from young adults who'd made spontaneous decisions to visit friends or take trips without informing their family. But Lisa Walsh's disappearance didn't fit the usual pattern. Bradley interviewed Jenny Patterson, who described Lisa as the most responsible person she'd ever known. He talked to Lisa's professors, who confirmed that she'd never missed classes without prior notification. He spoke with her employer at the college bookstore, where she worked part-time, and with several classmates who all described Lisa as reliable, studious, and not the type to engage in risky behavior. The search for Lisa Walsh began in earnest on Saturday morning, February. Sheriff William Hawkins, a 28-year veteran who'd been elected to his position in 1966, organized search parties consisting of deputies, volunteers from the community, and members of the Hamilton County Civil Defense Unit. They started with the most obvious places: the route between Walsh's diner and Lisa's apartment, the college campus, and the wooded areas around Riverside where a car might have slid off the road during the storm. The volunteers included dozens of people who'd known Lisa her entire life. Her high school teachers joined the search, along with classmates from both high school and college. Customers from the diner volunteered their time, and even competing restaurant owners closed their establishments to help look for the Walsh family's daughter. The search was methodical and thorough, covering an expanding grid that eventually encompassed most of Hamilton County. On Saturday afternoon, around 4 p.m., the search teams found Lisa's car. The bright yellow Volkswagen Beetle was parked in the lot behind the Greyhound bus station on the outskirts of Riverside, about 3 miles from Miller Creek Bridge. The car was unlocked, with Lisa's keys missing from the ignition. A quick search of the interior revealed nothing unusual. No signs of struggle, no personal belongings left behind, nothing to indicate what had happened to Lisa after she parked the car. The discovery of the car at the bus station seemed to provide an obvious explanation for Lisa's disappearance. Harold Finch, the night clerk who worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift at the Greyhound station, told deputies that he remembered selling a ticket to a young woman matching Lisa's description. The woman had purchased a one-way ticket to Cleveland on the 11:45 p.m. bus Thursday night, paying with cash and seeming nervous or agitated. She kept looking over her shoulder, Finch told Deputy Bradley during his interview on Sunday morning, like she was afraid someone was following her or something. I asked if she was okay, and she just nodded and said she needed to get out of town. Young girls, you know how they are, always got some kind of drama going on. The bus ticket explained everything, or so it seemed. Lisa had left work Thursday night, driven to the bus station, and caught the late bus to Cleveland. From Cleveland she could have connected to buses going anywhere in the country: California, Florida, New York. The world was full of possibilities for a young woman who suddenly decided she needed a change of scenery. But the Walsh family refused to accept this explanation. Robert and Margaret knew their daughter better than anyone, and Lisa simply wasn't the type of person to run away without a word. She was close to her parents, satisfied with her life in Riverside, and had concrete plans for her future that included finishing college and starting a teaching career. Running away to parts unknown made absolutely no sense. That's not Lisa, Margaret told Sheriff Hawkins during a meeting in his office on Monday morning. Lisa wouldn't just leave without saying goodbye. She wouldn't abandon her education. She wouldn't leave her car behind, and she sure wouldn't put us through this kind of work. Something happened to her. Someone took her. Sheriff Hawkins was sympathetic but practical. In his experience, young people often surprised their families with decisions that seemed completely out of character. College could be stressful. Small-town life could feel suffocating to someone Lisa's age, and the late 1960s and early 1970s were a time when many young Americans were rebelling against traditional expectations and seeking adventure in unfamiliar places. Give it some time, he advised the Walsh family. She'll call when she gets settled wherever she's going. These kids, they think they're protecting you by not saying goodbye. They don't realize how much worry they cause. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, with no word from Lisa. Sheriff Hawkins kept the case open and followed up on reported sightings from across the Midwest. A waitress in Chicago thought she'd served Lisa coffee. A store clerk in Detroit was certain she'd sold her clothing. A hotel manager in St. Louis remembered checking in a young woman who matched her description. But none of these leads produced any concrete evidence that Lisa Walsh was alive and living somewhere under an assumed identity. The investigation revealed some troubling details that hadn't been immediately apparent. Several witnesses reported seeing unusual activity around Miller Creek Bridge on the night Lisa disappeared. Miss Dorothy Kramer, an elderly widow who lived in a house overlooking the bridge, told deputies that she'd seen a car stopped on the bridge around 10 p.m., with its headlights on and two figures standing beside it. The snow had been falling heavily, making it impossible to see details, but she was certain that one of the figures was significantly larger than the other. More importantly, Mrs. Kramer reported seeing a second vehicle, a dark-colored pickup truck parked on the far side of the bridge. The truck had left shortly after the car's headlights went out, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. People sometimes stopped on the bridge to check weather conditions or to let their engines warm up during cold snaps. Deputy Bradley interviewed Mrs. Kramer extensively, but she was 78 years old, and admitted that her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, especially at night and in poor weather conditions. She couldn't provide descriptions of the people she'd seen, couldn't identify the make or model of either vehicle, and couldn't even be completely certain about the timing of what she'd witnessed. The investigation also revealed that Lisa had seemed somewhat anxious in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, though no one could pinpoint a specific reason for her concern. Jenny Patterson mentioned that Lisa had been having trouble sleeping and had asked several questions about changing her class schedule or possibly transferring to a different college. Her supervisor at the bookstore noticed that Lisa had seemed distracted and had made several small mistakes in her work that were uncharacteristic for someone usually so careful and detail-oriented. Most puzzling of all, Lisa had apparently made several phone calls in the days before her disappearance to numbers that couldn't be traced or identified. The calls appeared on her phone bill, but when deputies contacted the numbers, they either weren't in service or belonged to businesses or individuals who claimed they'd never spoken with Lisa Walsh. Despite these concerning details, the official conclusion remained the same. Lisa Walsh had voluntarily left Riverside, Ohio on the night of February 18, 1971. The case remained open, but it was essentially inactive after the first year of investigation. Sheriff Hawkins had limited resources and other cases that required immediate attention. Missing persons investigations were expensive and time-consuming, especially when they involved following up on sightings in distant states. The Walsh family never stopped believing that something terrible had happened to their daughter. Robert and Margaret hired a private investigator in 1973. Spending their savings on a 6-month investigation that produced no new lead. They contacted missing persons organizations, appeared on local television shows, and maintained correspondence with families of other missing young women across the Midwest. But as the years passed, their hope gradually eroded into a dull ache of permanent uncertainty. Margaret Walsh died of a heart attack in 1998, 27 years after Lisa's disappearance. She was found in Lisa's childhood bedroom, which she had preserved exactly as Lisa had left it in 1971, sitting in a chair beside the window with a photograph of her daughter in her hand. Robert followed 2 years later, his death certificate citing congestive heart failure, though everyone who knew him understood that he had died of a broken heart. They were buried in Riverside Cemetery, their joint headstone reading, "Robert and Margaret Walsh, beloved parents of Lisa Marie Walsh, until we meet again." The inscription reflected their enduring hope that death would reunite them with the daughter they had never stopped loving and never stopped mourning. Miller Creek Bridge continued to serve the Riverside community for another 50 years after Lisa's disappearance. The concrete span showed increasing signs of age and wear as the decades passed. By the 1990s, county engineers were filing annual reports recommending its replacement, citing structural concerns and the need to meet modern safety standards. But Hamilton County remained financially strapped, and the bridge replacement project was repeatedly delayed due to budgeting constraints. Finally, in 2022, the Ohio Department of Transportation allocated funding for a comprehensive infrastructure improvement project that included replacing Miller Creek Bridge. The project was part of a statewide initiative to update aging bridges and roadways, with federal funding covering 80% of the costs, and local governments responsible for the remaining. Riverside Construction Company won the contract for the bridge replacement, a family-owned business that had been serving Hamilton County for 4 generations. The company was owned by the Morrison family, who had deep roots in the community and personal connections to many of the families who would be affected by the construction project. Danny Morrison, the company's current president and grandson of its founder, had actually been a sophomore at Riverside High School when Lisa Walsh disappeared. He remembered the search parties, the way the entire community had mobilized to look for her, and the gradual acceptance that she had probably run away to start a new life somewhere else. Danny had even participated in some of the early search efforts, joining groups of volunteers who combed through wooded areas and abandoned buildings looking for any sign of the missing college student. The demolition of Miller Creek Bridge began on April 15, 2023, a warm Tuesday morning that carried the promise of spring after a long, cold winter. The Morrison crew used heavy equipment to break up the old concrete deck, loading chunks into dump trucks to be hauled away to a recycling facility in Cincinnati. The work was routine and uneventful for the first several days, progressing exactly according to the project timeline. The crew consisted of 8 experienced construction workers, most of whom had worked together on previous projects throughout Hamilton County. Jake Martinez was the equipment operator responsible for the excavator, a massive machine that could tear through concrete and steel with mechanical precision. Jake was 34 years old, a 10-year veteran of construction work, who took pride in his ability to operate complex machinery safely and efficiently. On Thursday morning, April 20th, Jake was working on excavating the foundation supports on the north side of the bridge. The concrete footings went deeper than the original engineering plans had indicated, requiring more extensive excavation than the crew had anticipated. Jake was carefully removing chunks of concrete and debris, separating recyclable materials from waste that would need to be disposed of in a landfill. Around 10:30 a.m., Jake's excavator bucket brought up something that made him immediately shut down the engine. Mixed in with the concrete rubble were several objects that looked disturbingly like bones. A skull with obvious fractures, ribs that were clearly human in origin, and what appeared to be fragments of leg bones. "Danny, you need to get over here right now," Jake called out, his voice tight with concern and disbelief. Morrison walked over to where Jake was standing beside the excavator, peering into the bucket that contained the morning's excavation. The bones were unmistakably human, a partial skeleton that had been disturbed by decades of freeze-thaw cycles, root growth, and the mechanical stress of supporting a concrete bridge, but preserved well enough to tell their story. Within 30 minutes, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene. Sheriff Patricia Hayes, who had taken over the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department when Sheriff Hawkins retired in 1995, arrived with a team of deputies to secure the area and begin the process of evidence collection. The State Bureau of Criminal Investigation was notified, and a forensic anthropologist from Ohio State University was contacted to assist with the recovery and analysis of the remains. Jennifer Watson, the forensic anthropologist, arrived at the scene around 2 p.m. with a team of graduate students and specialized equipment for excavating and cataloging human remains. Watson was a nationally recognized expert in forensic archaeology, with experience in mass disaster victim identification and cold case investigations. She had worked on high-profile cases throughout the Midwest, including several that had received national media attention. The excavation process was painstakingly slow and methodical. Each bone fragment had to be photographed in place, carefully removed with brushes and small tools, and catalogued according to its position relative to other remains and artifacts. The work continued until sunset on Thursday, resumed at dawn on Friday, and stretched through the weekend as more remains and associated evidence were recovered from the foundation area. The skeleton was incomplete, as Dr. Watson had expected given the circumstances of its burial and the length of time it had been underground. Acidic soil conditions and root action had destroyed some of the smaller bones, and the construction of the original bridge foundation had likely disturbed the burial site when concrete was poured in, but enough remained to tell a compelling story about the victim's identity and the circumstances of their death. The skull showed evidence of massive blunt force trauma, multiple fractures that would have been immediately fatal. The victim had been struck repeatedly with a heavy object, possibly a hammer or similar tool. The positioning of the remains suggested the body had been buried hastily in a shallow grave, then covered with concrete when the bridge foundation was constructed. Personal effects recovered from the gravesite provided crucial clues about the victim's identity. A silver bracelet, tarnished but intact, bore an engraving that read, "Lisa, love, Mom and Dad, Christmas." A class ring from Riverside High School, inscribed with the year 1969, had been partially dissolved by acid soil but was still identifiable. Most significantly, fragments of fabric consistent with a winter coat were found wrapped around the skeletal remains. The forensic evidence pointed to a single, unavoidable conclusion. These were the remains of Lisa Marie Walsh, the college student who had supposedly run away to California 52 years earlier. The news of Lisa's discovery sent shockwaves throughout Riverside and Hamilton County. The revelation that she had never left town, had never bought a bus ticket, and had been buried under one of the community's most heavily traveled bridges, forced everyone to confront a terrible truth. Lisa had been murdered, and for more than half a century her killer had been walking free. Sheriff Hayes immediately reopened the Lisa Walsh case, assigning her most experienced detective, Sarah Chen, to lead the investigation. Chen was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement with extensive training in cold case investigations and forensic technique. She had successfully solved several decades-old murders using modern DNA analysis and investigative methods that hadn't been available to the original investigators in that. The first phase of Chen's investigation involved re-examining every piece of evidence from the original case with the benefit of current technology and forensic capabilities. The most promising avenue was DNA analysis of tissue samples recovered from Lisa's remains. While the genetic material was degraded after 52 years underground, advances in extraction and amplification techniques made it possible to develop a partial DNA profile that could be compared against databases of known offenders and crime scene evidence. But it was the re-examination of witness testimony and police reports that provided the most shocking revelations about the original investigation. Detective Chen discovered that Harold Finch, the Greyhound station clerk who claimed to have sold Lisa a bus ticket, had been lying about his encounter with her. This information came to light when Chen interviewed Finch's daughter Karen, who was now 73 years old and living in a nursing home in Cincinnati. Karen had been reluctant to speak with investigators initially, but the discovery of Lisa's body and the renewed attention to her case convinced her that the time had come to reveal a secret she had carried for more than 3 decades. "My father confessed to me before he died," Karen told Detective Chen during their interview at the Golden Years Care Center. "He said a man came to him the day after that girl went missing and paid him to lie about selling her a bus ticket. $500, which was a lot of money. Daddy was struggling financially, my mother was sick with cancer, and they needed money for her medical bills." Karen's revelation meant that the entire foundation of the original investigation had been false. Lisa hadn't run away, she had been murdered, and someone had deliberately planted false evidence to misdirect the police investigation and prevent her body from being discovered. "Daddy always felt terrible about it," Karen continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "He thought he was just helping some girl who wanted to disappear, maybe get away from an abusive boyfriend or family problems. He never imagined she was dead. When he found out years later that she was still missing, that her parents were still looking for her, it ate him up but by then he was too scared to come forward. He was afraid he'd go to jail for lying to the police." Harold Finch had died in 1989, taking his secret to the grave and leaving Lisa's family to endure another decade of uncertainty and false hope. His deathbed confession to his daughter revealed the cynical calculation behind Lisa's disappearance. Someone had murdered her and then paid a desperate man to provide false testimony that would convince police she had left town voluntarily. But who had killed Lisa Walsh? And more importantly, who had paid Harold Finch to lie about the bus ticket? Detective Chen began reconstructing the events of February 18, 1971, using a combination of original witness statements, physical evidence, and new investigative techniques that hadn't been available to the original investigator. She created detailed timelines and maps, interviewed surviving witnesses, and consulted with forensic experts who could provide insights into the killer's methods and motivations. The investigation revealed several crucial details that had been overlooked or dismissed during the original case. Multiple witnesses had reported seeing Lisa's distinctive yellow Volkswagen Beetle on Miller Creek Bridge around 10 p.m. on the night she disappeared, but these reports had been discounted once police accepted the bus station theory. Miss Dorothy Kramer, the elderly woman who lived near the bridge, had died in 1987, but her original statement to police contained details that took on new significance in light of Lisa's murder. She had described seeing 2 vehicles on the bridge, Lisa's car and a dark pickup truck, and had observed what appeared to be a confrontation between 2 people before both vehicles left the area. Detective Chen obtained employment records and vehicle registration information for everyone in Hamilton County who had owned dark pickup trucks in The list was extensive, including dozens of farmers, construction workers, utility company employees, and municipal workers who used trucks in their daily operations. One name on the list immediately caught Chen's attention: the Riverside Department of Public Works. The department had operated several dark-colored pickup trucks in 1971, and their employees had unrestricted access to all municipal infrastructure, including Miller Creek Bridge. Chen obtained personnel records from the Public Works Department for February. The night shift supervisor during that period was Walter Dixon, a 45-year-old bachelor who had worked for the city since. Dixon's job responsibilities included responding to emergency calls during nighttime hours, conducting safety inspections of municipal infrastructure, and coordinating repairs to roads, bridges, and public utilities. The more Chen learned about Walter Dixon, the more suspicious she became. Dixon had been a quiet, somewhat antisocial man who lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Riverside. He was described by neighbors and co-workers as reliable but strange, someone who kept to himself and rarely participated in social activity. Most significantly, Dixon had volunteered to help search for Lisa Walsh after she was reported missing, spending several days participating in organized search efforts while knowing exactly where her body was located. Dixon's personnel file contained information that should have made him a person of interest in the original investigation, but had apparently been overlooked by Sheriff Hawkins and his deputy. Dixon had been questioned by police in connection with 2 other incidents involving young women in the late night. In both cases, women had reported being followed or approached by a man matching Dixon's description, but no charges had been filed due to lack of evidence and the women's reluctance to pursue the matter. The breakthrough in Chen's investigation came when she discovered Dixon's work schedule for February 18, 1971. According to departmental records, Dixon had been called out for an emergency bridge inspection at Miller Creek Bridge on the night Lisa disappeared. The call had come in around 9:45 p.m., just 15 minutes after Lisa left Walsh's diner for her drive home, but there were no follow-up reports documenting the results of this emergency inspection. No repair orders were issued, no safety concerns were noted, and no supervisor was notified about any structural problems with the bridge. The emergency call appeared to have been fabricated, providing Dixon with a legitimate reason to be at the bridge during the time frame when Lisa was murdered. Chen realized that Dixon had used his position with the Public Works Department to create the perfect cover for his crime. As the night shift supervisor, he had access to city vehicles and equipment, including the tools and machinery that would have been necessary to excavate a gravesite and bury Lisa's body under the bridge foundation. His official duties gave him unlimited access to the bridge at any hour, and his reputation as a dedicated city employee meant that no one would question his presence there during a snowstorm. The detective's theory of the crime began to take shape. Dixon had likely been stalking Lisa, learning her routine and waiting for the right opportunity to attack her. On the night of February 18th, he had positioned himself on Miller Creek Bridge, knowing that Lisa would have to cross it on her way home from work. When she stopped to help what she thought was a stranded motorist, Dixon's truck parked with its hood raised, he had attacked her with a blunt instrument, possibly a hammer or crowbar from his work equipment. After killing Lisa, Dixon had used his city excavation equipment to dig a grave under the north foundation of the bridge, buried her body, and then covered the site with concrete to hide all evidence of his crime. The next day, he had paid Harold Finch $500 to provide false testimony about selling Lisa a bus ticket, creating the illusion that she had left town voluntarily. But Walter Dixon had died in 1987 at the age of 61, taking his secrets to the grave. Without the possibility of obtaining a confession, Detective Chen needed physical evidence to prove her theory about his involvement in Lisa's murder. The answer came from an unexpected source. In 2022, Dixon's former house had been purchased by a young couple who planned to renovate the property completely. During the renovation, workers had discovered a hidden compartment in the basement wall, concealed behind a false panel that had been installed decades earlier. The hidden compartment contained items that would have horrified anyone who found them: jewelry, photographs, pieces of clothing, and other personal belongings that appeared to be souvenirs or trophies taken from victims. Among these disturbing mementos was Lisa Walsh's driver's license, which had never been found with her abandoned car, and a gold locket that matched the description of one Lisa had been wearing on the night she disappeared. DNA analysis of several items from the hidden collection linked them to missing persons cases from the 1960s and 1970s, cases that had never been solved and had been attributed to young women who had supposedly run away from home. The evidence suggested that Walter Dixon had been a serial killer who had preyed on vulnerable young women for at least a decade, using his position with the city to avoid suspicion and dispose of his victims' bodies. Detective Chen's investigation ultimately identified Dixon as the perpetrator in 6 separate murder cases spanning nearly 20 years. Lisa Walsh had been one of his victims, but certainly not the first or the last. The revelation that a trusted city employee had been responsible for multiple murders sent shockwaves through Riverside and the surrounding communities, forcing residents to confront the uncomfortable reality that a predator had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The case file that Chen compiled on Walter Dixon painted the picture of a sophisticated killer who had used his municipal position to perfection. His work with the Public Works Department gave him detailed knowledge of remote locations throughout Hamilton County where bodies could be concealed. His access to heavy equipment allowed him to bury victims in places where they would never be found. His reputation as a dedicated public servant provided cover for his movements and activities, and his participation in search efforts for missing persons allowed him to monitor police investigations while appearing to be a concerned community member. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts described Dixon as an organized killer who planned his crimes carefully and took extensive measures to avoid detection. His decision to pay Harold Finch to provide false testimony demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that explained why he had been able to avoid suspicion for so many years. The hidden trophy collection in his basement suggested that he derived psychological satisfaction from reliving his crimes and maintaining physical connections to his victim. The discovery of Lisa Walsh's remains and the subsequent investigation into Walter Dixon's crimes brought long overdue closure to multiple families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their daughter. But it also raised disturbing questions about the original investigations and the institutional failures that had allowed Dixon to continue killing for years after his first known murder. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Department commissioned an independent review of all missing persons cases from the 1960s and 1970s to determine if other murders might have been misclassified as voluntary disappearance. The review, conducted by retired FBI investigators, uncovered systematic failures in the original investigations that had allowed Dixon to operate without detection. The most shocking revelation was that Dixon had been questioned as a potential suspect in at least 3 of the missing persons cases, but had never been seriously investigated due to his sterling reputation and his cooperation with search efforts. In each case, Dixon had volunteered information that helped direct suspicion away from himself while providing assistance that made him appear to be a concerned community member rather than a predator. The new Miller Creek Bridge was completed in November 2023, a modern concrete span equipped with LED lighting and safety features that met current engineering standards. At the dedication ceremony, Sheriff Hayes announced the installation of a memorial plaque honoring Lisa Walsh and the other victims of Walter Dixon's crimes. The plaque read, "In memory of Lisa Marie Walsh and all victims of violence, may their stories never be forgotten." Lisa's remains were finally laid to rest beside her parents in Riverside Cemetery on December 15, 2023, exactly 52 years and 10 months after she disappeared. The funeral service was attended by hundreds of community members, including many who had participated in the original search efforts and had never forgotten the bright young woman who had simply wanted to come home on a snowy February night. The case of Lisa Walsh serves as a powerful reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that sometimes justice requires decades to achieve. For the residents of Riverside, Ohio, the discovery under Miller Creek Bridge changed everything they thought they knew about their community and the people they had trusted to serve and protect them. The bones under the bridge had finally told their story, exposing the truth about a killer who had hidden in plain sight for decades. Walter Dixon had taken his secrets to the grave, but the evidence he left behind eventually spoke for his victims, ensuring that their stories would be heard and their murders would be acknowledged even though justice could no longer be served in a traditional courtroom. Lisa Marie Walsh had waited 52 years to come home, but she finally made it, and in finding her, Detective Chin had uncovered a pattern of violence that had terrorized Hamilton County for decades without anyone realizing it. The young woman who had dreamed of teaching kindergarten students had, in death, taught her entire community the most important lesson of all, that we must never stop searching for the truth, no matter how long it takes or how deeply it has been buried. The story of what happened under Miller Creek Bridge will be remembered for generations in Riverside, Ohio, as both a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk in familiar places and a testament to the power of persistence in the pursuit of justice. Lisa Walsh's legacy lives on not just in the memorial plaque that bears her name, but in the renewed commitment by law enforcement to never give up on cold cases and never assume that missing persons have simply chosen to disappear. Her story reminds us all that behind every unsolved case is a real person with hopes, dreams, and people who love them, and that every victim deserves to have their story told, their truth revealed, and their memory honored. The bones under the bridge had waited more than half a century to tell their tale, but when they finally could speak, they spoke with a voice that could not be silenced or ignored. The deeper Detective Chen dug into Walter Dixon's past, the more disturbing the picture became. Through her collaboration with law enforcement agencies across 3 states, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. Dixon hadn't just been a local predator, he had been operating across state lines for over 2 decades. Using his municipal position and the trust it afforded him to hunt victims in communities far from Riverside, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit assigned Special Agent Michael Torres to work with Chen on what was now being classified as a multi-jurisdictional serial killer investigation. Torres brought expertise in analyzing long-term predatory behavior patterns, and his initial assessment confirmed Chen's worst fears about Dixon's scope of operation. "What we're seeing here is textbook organized serial killer behavior," Torres explained to Chen during their first meeting at the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department. Dixon used his legitimate job responsibilities as cover for reconnaissance activities. His work vehicle, his uniform, his municipal identification, all of these gave him access to communities and potential victims who would never have been suspicious of his presence. The investigation revealed that Dixon had requested numerous out-of-town assignments throughout his career, ostensibly for training purposes or to assist other municipal departments with infrastructure projects. But when Chen cross-referenced these trips with missing persons cases from the corresponding time periods and locations, disturbing correlations began to appear. In 1974, Dixon had attended a 3-day conference on water treatment systems in Louisville, Kentucky. During that same weekend, 18-year-old Rebecca Martinez had disappeared while walking home from her job at a local restaurant. Her body was never found, and the case remained unsolved. In 1976, Dixon had traveled to Indianapolis for a seminar on road maintenance technique. 20-year-old Jennifer Coleman vanished from a shopping center parking lot 2 blocks from Dixon's hotel during his stay. The pattern continued throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. Dixon would request legitimate work-related travel, establish his presence in unfamiliar communities where he could operate without recognition, and then target young women who fit his preferred victim profile. College-aged, living independently, with predictable routines that made them easy to surveil and approach. Agent Torres's psychological profile painted Dixon as a meticulous planner, who derived satisfaction not just from the killings themselves, but from the elaborate deceptions he constructed to avoid detection. His municipal position wasn't just convenient cover, it was an integral part of his fantasy life, allowing him to play the role of helpful public servant while secretly stalking and murdering innocent women. This level of compartmentalization is extremely rare, Torres noted in his preliminary report. Dixon maintained his public persona so successfully that he actually convinced himself he was performing a public service. In his mind, he wasn't just a city employee who happened to kill. He was a killer who used city employment as his hunting license. The most chilling discovery came when Chen examined Dixon's personal effects, which had been stored in the basement of his former residence since his death, and among his belongings were detailed maps of cities he had visited, with specific locations marked in red ink. When investigators compared these markings to known crime scenes and missing persons locations, they found matches in 12 different cases across 4 states. Dixon had been keeping score, documenting his crimes with the same methodical attention to detail he had applied to his municipal work. Each marked location represented not just a crime but a trophy, evidence of his success in evading detection while operating in plain sight for over 2 decades. The revelation transformed the Lisa Walsh case from a single murder investigation into one of the largest serial killer cases in Midwest history. Dixon's victim count, previously estimated at 6, now appeared to exceed 20 women across Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and Michigan. The scope of his crimes had been hidden not just by time and jurisdictional boundaries, but by his carefully cultivated reputation as a dedicated public servant who would never harm anyone. For the families of missing women across multiple states, Dixon's identification brought both closure and renewed anguish. Decades of wondering what had happened to their daughters finally had an answer, but that answer revealed a level of calculated evil that was almost impossible to comprehend. The man who had terrorized their communities hadn't been a shadowy stranger, he had been someone they had trusted, someone whose job required them to open their doors and welcome him into their homes. As the full scope of Walter Dixon's crimes continued to emerge, one thing became horrifyingly clear. Lisa Marie Walsh had been just one victim in a reign of terror that had spanned decades and state lines, hidden behind a facade of public service that had allowed a monster to hunt with impunity while the very communities he served remained completely unaware of the predator living among them.